There are nights when nothing important happens. No great decisions are made. No history books are written. And yet, those nights quietly pass, carrying the weight of time itself. This is one of those nights. If you enjoy slow, quiet stories about real places and ordinary lives, you may consider subscribing. This channel is made for long nights, tired minds, and anyone who finds comfort in calm history. Now, let's return to the station. The clock on the wall read 11:17 p.m. It had been ticking the same way for as long as anyone could remember. Each second fell into the next without hurry, without emotion, without concern for who was listening. The small-town train station sat quietly at the edge of town, surrounded by darkness and still air. In 1915, this station was no longer new, but it was not yet old enough to feel forgotten. Its wooden floors creaked gently when the temperature changed, and the tall windows reflected the dim yellow glow of oil lamps hanging from iron hooks. Outside, the platform stretched into the night, empty and calm. A thin layer of dust rested between the rails, undisturbed since the last train had passed hours earlier. Somewhere far beyond the fields, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. Inside the station, Thomas Reed sat alone at the desk near the telegraph. He had worked the overnight shift for almost 12 years now, not because he loved the hours, not because he disliked people, but because someone always had to be here, even when nothing happened. Thomas adjusted his posture slightly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his back. The chair beneath him was old but reliable, shaped slowly by years of night workers who sat waiting for sounds that might never come. The telegraph machine was quiet, too quiet. Thomas glanced at it, though he already knew it wouldn't speak tonight. Messages came earlier in the evening when freight schedules were confirmed and delays were reported. By this hour, the wires usually rested. He reached for the ledger book and turned a page carefully. November 3rd, 1915. Weather, clear. Temperature, cool. Arrivals, none expected before dawn. He dipped his pen into the ink and added a small note, writing slowly so the ink would not smudge. Station, calm. He paused after the words, then gently closed the book. The lamp above his desk flickered once, then steadied. The soft glow filled the room, touching the edges of wooden benches, the ticket window, and the faded timetable nailed to the wall. The timetable was outdated, but no one bothered to replace it. Most folks in town already knew when the trains came, and, more importantly, when they didn't. Thomas stood up and walked toward the door, his boots making quiet sounds against the floor. He opened it and stepped onto the platform. The night air was cool and carried the faint scent of coal and dry grass. Above him, the sky was clear, scattered with stars that seemed distant and indifferent. He pulled his coat a little tighter and walked slowly along the platform, stopping near the edge. The rails disappeared into the darkness, stretching toward places Thomas had never seen. He had watched thousands of trains arrive and leave over the years. People stepped off with hope in their eyes, or boarded with heavy hearts. Soldiers, merchants, families, travelers passing through without learning the town's name. Tonight, there would be none of them, and that was fine. A thin breeze passed through,
stirring dust and brushing against his coat. Thomas listened, not for a train, but for the familiar quiet that told him everything was as it should be. He checked his pocket watch. 11:41 p.m. Still hours until dawn. Thomas returned inside and poured himself a cup of lukewarm coffee from the pot near the wall. It had been sitting there for some time, but he drank it anyway, slowly, without complaint. The taste no longer mattered much to him. He sat again, folding his hands on the desk. This was the part of the night that felt longest. Too early to feel tired, too late to feel busy. Outside, the station waited.
The station settled back into its quiet rhythm. Thomas took another small sip of coffee, then set the cup aside and listened. The building always made sounds at night. Not loud ones, not important ones, just the soft reminders that wood, metal, and glass never truly rested. Somewhere above him, the roof contracted slightly as the temperature shifted. A window frame clicked, then went still again. He did not look up. After so many years, he could tell which sounds mattered and which did not. A sharp crack might mean a loose board. A whistle of wind could signal a door left open. Tonight, everything sounded exactly the way it should. Thomas leaned back in his chair and let his gaze drift toward the far wall, where a faded map of the railway lines hung beneath a thin layer of dust. Red and black lines crisscrossed the paper, connecting towns he had heard of and others he never would. Some of the names were familiar, places where trains paused just long enough for passengers to stretch their legs. Others were nothing more than dots on paper. He had never followed those lines himself. Once, years ago, someone asked him why. He couldn't remember what answer he had given then, but now, sitting alone in the lamplight, the reason felt simple. Someone had to remain in place so others could pass through. The station was not meant to travel. Neither, in a way, was he. The clock ticked. 11:58 p.m. Nearly midnight. Thomas stood again, moving slowly this time, and walked toward the ticket window. The glass was clean, though no tickets would be sold until morning. He ran a cloth across the counter out of habit, smoothing away dust that would return by dawn. The motion was gentle and unhurried. Outside, the platform lay unchanged. No footsteps, no voices. The rails reflected faint lines of light where the lamp glow reached them, then vanished into darkness once more. Thomas opened the door and stepped out again. Midnight passed without ceremony. There was no announcement, no bell rang. The town slept on, unaware that a new day had technically begun. Thomas acknowledged it only by glancing at his watch and nodding slightly to himself. He walked to the far end of the platform and stopped near a wooden bench worn smooth by years of waiting bodies. He rested a hand on its back and felt the cold soak into his palm. The bench had heard more conversations than he ever would. Goodbyes whispered in low voices, nervous laughter, long silences. Tonight it heard nothing. A distant sound drifted through the air, not a train, just the wind moving through fields beyond town. Thomas listened until it faded, then turned back toward the station building. His reflection appeared briefly in the dark glass of the door, distorted by the angle and the low light. He looked older at night. The lamplight emphasized the lines around his eyes and the gray at his temples. During the day, with people moving through and tasks to perform, he rarely noticed these things. But at night, when time slowed, everything became more visible. Inside, he returned to the desk and opened the ledger again. He added a single line beneath the earlier note. Midnight passed. Station remains quiet. He closed the book, satisfied. There was comfort in writing things down, even when nothing changed, especially then. It was proof that time had moved forward, even if it felt suspended. Thomas adjusted the lamp wick slightly, lowering the flame just enough to soften the light. Shadows stretched longer across the floor, pooling beneath benches and corners. The station felt larger when lit this way, its empty spaces more pronounced. He sat down once more. Minutes slipped by unnoticed. His breathing slowed, matching the steady rhythm of the clock. He did not feel sleepy yet, not truly, but his thoughts had grown gentle and unhurried. Memories surfaced without effort. The first night he worked alone, the smell of fresh paint back then, the nervous way he checked the schedule every few minutes, afraid he would miss something. Now he knew better. If a train came, he would hear it long before it arrived. The telegraph remained silent. Thomas rested his hands on the desk and stared at the grain of the wood, following its patterns as though they were paths of their own. Outside, somewhere beyond the station, the town breathed quietly. Houses stood dark. Streets lay empty. Somewhere, a single light might still be burning in a kitchen or bedroom. But here, at the edge of town, the night belonged entirely to him. The clock continued its patient work. 12:23 a.m. Still no trains. Still no messages. Still nothing required of him except to remain. And so he did, keeping watch over a place where nothing happened and where that nothing felt exactly right.
The air inside the station grew cooler as the night deepened. Thomas noticed it first in his hands. He flexed his fingers slowly, then tucked them into the pockets of his coat for a moment before resting them on the desk again. The lamp's warmth reached only so far, leaving the corners of the room dim and still. The clock ticked on. 12:41 a.m. This was the hour when the station felt furthest from the rest of the world. Even during the quietest days, there was usually some sign of movement, a wagon passing on the road, a distant voice, the sound of a door opening somewhere in town. Now there was nothing. The silence felt complete, layered, as if the night had settled into place and decided not to move again for a while. Thomas stood and stretched gently, careful not to rush the motion. He walked to the stove in the corner, checked that it was still warm enough, and adjusted it just slightly. The metal made a faint sound as it responded, then fell silent. He poured himself a small amount of water this time, drinking it slowly. The simple act felt grounding. Nights like this were long, but they were never difficult. They asked very little of him. He returned to the window and looked out once more. The tracks lay unchanged, two parallel lines leading away into darkness. A thin mist had begun to gather near the ground, barely noticeable, hovering just above the gravel in wooden ties. It moved slowly, almost lazily, as if undecided about where to go. Thomas watched it without thinking. There had been nights when fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the station whole and turning the lamps into blurred halos. Tonight was not one of those nights. This mist was gentle, temporary. By morning it would be gone. He stepped outside again, his boots sounding softly against the platform boards. The cold was sharper now, but not unpleasant. He breathed in deeply and held the air for a moment before letting it out. Somewhere far off, an owl called once. Thomas did not react. He had heard it many times before. He walked the length of the platform at the same slow pace as earlier,
stopping near the signal post at the far end. The signal arm rested in its usual position, unmoved, unneeded. He checked it anyway, running his eyes over the mechanism out of habit. Everything was in order. He turned back toward the station, pausing once more near the bench. For a moment he considered sitting down, but decided against it. The bench felt colder now, less inviting than before. Inside again, he closed the door quietly and returned to his desk. The telegraph machine caught his attention then, not because it made a sound, but because of its continued silence. Thomas reached out and rested his fingers lightly on the metal surface. It was cool beneath his touch. There would be no messages tonight. He knew that as surely as he knew the clock would keep ticking. Still, part of his job was to remain ready, even when readiness was never tested. He pulled the ledger closer and flipped back through earlier pages. Most entries were brief: weather notes, arrival times, occasional delays, small remarks written in his careful handwriting. Together they formed a quiet record of days and nights that blended into one another. He stopped at an entry from years ago, written in darker ink. Late freight arrived at 2:10 a.m. Heavy fog. He remembered that night faintly, the way the train emerged suddenly from the mist, startling him despite all his experience. The memory passed without emotion, like everything else. He closed the book and placed it neatly back in its spot. The clock marked another stretch of time. 1:06 a.m. This was usually when fatigue began to settle in, not as sleepiness, but as a gentle heaviness. Thomas felt it now, a quiet reminder that his body followed rhythms whether he acknowledged them or not. He adjusted his chair, leaning back slightly, and allowed his thoughts to wander. He thought of the town as it must look right now: dark rooftops beneath the stars, streets empty, windows dim. By morning, people would wake and move again. Shops would open, trains would arrive, voices would fill the station. But this moment belonged only to the night. Thomas found comfort in that idea. He checked his watch once more, then placed it back into his pocket. There was no need to hurry time along by watching it too closely. The night would pass at its own pace, as it always did. Outside, the mist shifted again, thinning now, retreating from the tracks. The air felt clearer, sharper. Thomas listened, half expecting the distant hum that sometimes preceded an approaching train hours before it arrived. There was nothing. He smiled faintly, almost without realizing it. The station remained exactly as it was meant to be: quiet, waiting, patient. And so Thomas remained too, seated beneath the steady lamplight, keeping watch as another small portion of the night slipped by unnoticed, unrecorded, except by the slow, faithful movement of the clock.
The station seemed to breathe, not in any way that could be heard, but in the subtle shifts of air and temperature, the almost imperceptible settling of wood and iron. Thomas sensed it more than noticed it, the way one senses the presence of a familiar room even with eyes closed. The clock moved on. 1:28 a.m. This hour always felt the same to him, no matter the season. It carried a certain stillness, deeper than before midnight and heavier than the hours that followed. It was the part of the night when even thoughts slowed down, when memories appeared without invitation and drifted away without leaving much behind. Thomas stood and walked once more, not because he needed to, but because remaining still for too long made time feel thicker. His boots traced the same familiar path across the floor, past the benches, toward the door, then back again. Each step was measured, unhurried. He paused by the timetable again. Some of the printed times were no longer accurate. Routes had changed. Trains had been added and removed. Still, the paper remained,
yellowed and curling slightly at the edges. Thomas had suggested replacing it once, years ago, but no one ever seemed to find the time. It did no harm where it was. He reached up and straightened one corner that had begun to droop. The action felt ceremonial, as if he were tending to something fragile and unimportant at the same time. Outside, the night continued its quiet work. The stars had shifted almost imperceptibly, though Thomas did not consciously notice it. The fields beyond the tracks lay dark and open, stretching farther than he could see. Somewhere beyond them, the world moved on, cities awake, trains running, people speaking, but none of it reached the station now. Thomas returned to his desk and sat. He rested his elbows lightly on the wood and folded his hands, gazing at the lamp flame. It burned steadily, its soft glow unchanged. He adjusted it again, lowering it just a fraction more. The room darkened slightly, but not enough to feel empty. This level of light felt right. He listened again. Still no telegraph, still no train, still nothing that required action. His breathing deepened, slowed. He was not asleep, not even close, but his body had settled into the long, patient waiting it knew so well. This was the part of the job few people ever thought about, not the arrivals or departures, not the schedules or the crowds, but the hours in between, when presence itself was the only task. Thomas thought of the men who had worked here before him. He knew some of their names from old records and casual stories passed down over time. Others were nothing more than signatures in ledgers long since filled. They had sat in this same room, listened to this same clock, watched the same quiet hours pass. The thought did not make him feel small or insignificant. If anything, it made him feel connected, part of something slow and continuous, like the tracks themselves. He reached for the ledger once more, then hesitated. There was nothing new to write. He left it closed. The stove gave off a faint metallic sound as the heat shifted again. Thomas glanced toward it, then returned his gaze to the window. The mist had fully cleared now, leaving the air crisp and sharp. The rails gleamed faintly where the lamplight touched them. A distant sound reached his ears, so faint it could have been imagined. Thomas straightened slightly. He waited. The sound did not return. It had not been a train, just the night settling, or perhaps the wind passing through something far away. He relaxed again, allowing the momentary alertness to fade. 1:54 a.m., nearly 2 o'clock. This was usually when he allowed himself a longer pause, leaning back in the chair, eyes resting on nothing in particular. He did so now, feeling the chair support his weight, the floor solid beneath him. He thought briefly of morning. The first light would arrive quietly, slipping in through the windows long before anyone else did. The station would look different then, less mysterious, more ordinary. Dust would be visible again. The timetable would appear more faded. The benches would look emptier somehow, even when they were filled. He did not rush toward that thought. There was still time before then. Outside, an almost imperceptible breeze moved across the platform, stirring nothing of consequence. The town remained asleep. The station remained awake. Thomas adjusted his coat and sat exactly as he was, listening to the clock complete another full circle of seconds. Nothing changed, and in the soft, unbroken quiet of the early morning hours, that absence of change felt like its own kind of work, steady, uneventful, and complete.
The night held its shape. Thomas felt it in the way the station remained exactly as it was, as though time itself had decided to pause for a while. The air no longer shifted much. The sounds had settled into a pattern so faint that noticing them required effort. The clock advanced, 2:12 a.m. This hour carried a particular quiet,
deeper than the ones before it. Even the idea of interruption felt distant now. Thomas sat with his shoulders relaxed, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He had stopped checking his watch frequently. There was no need. He stood again, slower than before, and walked toward the door. Opening it, he stepped onto the platform once more. The wood beneath his boots felt colder now, firm and unmoving. He stood still, letting the night surround him. The sky above had changed subtly. The stars were still there, but they felt less sharp, as though the darkness had softened them. Thomas breathed in and out, steady and calm. He walked toward the tracks and stopped just short of them, careful not to step too close. He had learned long ago to respect the rails, even when they were silent. They had a presence of their own, a sense of purpose that never entirely slept. He listened again. Nothing. No vibration beneath his feet. No distant rumble. No whistle carried on the wind. Satisfied, he turned back toward the station and made his way inside, closing the door gently behind him. The warmth of the lamp greeted him, faint but comforting. He paused for a moment, standing there, as though orienting himself back into the space. Then he returned to his chair. Thomas reached for the water again and took a small sip. It tasted cool and plain. He placed the cup down carefully, aligning it near the edge of the desk where he always kept it. Habits mattered during the night. They gave shape to hours that otherwise blurred together. He glanced at the ledger without opening it. There was still nothing to add. The words he had written earlier were enough. The station remained quiet. That fact had not changed. His gaze drifted toward the benches again. In the low light, they appeared almost softer, their edges less defined. During the day, they were just benches, practical, worn, unremarkable. At night, they felt like placeholders, waiting for people who would arrive later when the world resumed its movement. Thomas allowed his eyes to rest there for a while. He remembered nights when passengers arrived unexpectedly, travelers delayed by weather or mechanical trouble, stepping off trains with tired faces and heavy bags. Those nights brought brief conversations, questions about schedules, requests for directions. Tonight was not one of those nights, and that was fine. The clock continued its patient marking of time, 2:34 a.m. Fatigue settled a little deeper now, not enough to make him drowsy, but enough to soften his thoughts. His mind wandered gently, without focus. Small memories surfaced, the sound of his mother's voice years ago, the smell of rain on summer evenings, the way the station looked the first time he had unlocked it alone. None of these thoughts lingered for long. They drifted in, then out again, like the mist earlier in the night. Thomas adjusted his posture slightly, shifting his weight in the chair. He felt no urgency to move. The night asked nothing of him except to remain present. The stove gave off another faint sound as the heat settled. Thomas acknowledged it with a glance, then returned his attention to the room as a whole. Everything was steady. Everything was as it should be. Outside, the platform lay unchanged. The fields beyond were invisible now, merged completely with the darkness. Only the nearest stretch of rail caught the light, shining dully before fading away. 2:57 a.m. Nearly 3 o'clock. This was often the quietest point of the shift, when the night seemed to gather itself before slowly giving way to morning. Thomas felt that transition approaching, though it was still far off. The darkness no longer felt endless. It felt measured. He stood once more, stretching gently, and walked a slow circle around the room. His footsteps were soft, deliberate. He paused by the window, resting a hand lightly against the glass. It was cool beneath his palm. For a brief moment, he imagined the first hint of light appearing on the horizon, hours from now. He did not dwell on it. The present moment was enough. Returning to his chair, Thomas exhaled quietly. The clock ticked on. The station waited, and Thomas remained exactly where he needed to be, holding the night steady as it moved, minute by minute, toward whatever came next.
The night loosened its grip almost imperceptibly. Thomas sensed the change before he could name it. Nothing had shifted in a way that could be measured, and yet the stillness felt different, thinner, as though the darkness had begun to stretch, preparing to move on. The clock marked the moment, 3:16 a.m. This hour always felt quieter in a new way, not deeper, not heavier, simply calmer, the kind of calm that comes after a long wait, when even waiting no longer feels active. Thomas remained seated, his posture relaxed, his gaze unfocused. He no longer looked at specific objects in the room. Instead, he took in the station as a whole, the way the lamplight softened the corners, the way the shadows rested without shifting, the way everything seemed settled into place. He reached up and rubbed his eyes gently, careful not to press too hard. The gesture was slow, deliberate. He was not tired enough to sleep, but his body reminded him that the night had been long. He let his hands fall back to the desk. The telegraph remained silent, its presence now almost symbolic rather than practical. Thomas could not remember the last time it had carried a message during these hours. Still, it stayed where it was, ready, just in case. Outside, the air had grown colder again. Thomas noticed it when he stood and walked toward the door. He opened it slightly, just enough to let the night air slip inside. It carried no particular scent now, just clean coldness. He stepped out onto the platform. The sky had changed again. It was still dark, but no longer entirely black. Somewhere far to the east, the darkness had softened into a deep, almost imperceptible shade of gray. Thomas did not look directly toward it, but he felt it all the same. He walked slowly, stopping near the center of the platform. The boards beneath his feet felt solid and familiar. He placed his hands in his coat pockets and stood there, breathing evenly. No trains would come at this hour. He knew that. Even the freight lines were quiet now, their schedules arranged to avoid the slow hours before dawn. The tracks belonged entirely to the night. Thomas turned and walked back inside, closing the door carefully behind him. The warmth of the station felt more noticeable now, the contrast clearer. He returned to his chair and sat, adjusting the lamp just slightly higher this time. The room brightened a fraction. 3:39 a.m. This was usually when his thoughts grew simpler, not fewer, just quieter. He did not think in full sentences anymore. Images came instead. The station at sunrise, steam rising from fresh coffee, the sound of footsteps approaching from the road. He did not rush toward those thoughts. There was still time. He reached for the ledger again, opened it, and reviewed the page once more. The entries were sparse but complete. There was nothing else to add. Still, he read the words again, as if confirming that the night had unfolded exactly as he remembered it. He closed the book and placed it back in its spot. Thomas leaned back in his chair and let his head rest lightly against the wall behind him. His eyes closed for a moment, not in sleep, but in rest. He listened to the clock, letting its steady rhythm anchor him. Tick, tick, tick. The sound was no longer something he noticed consciously. It blended into the background of the night, as constant as his own breathing. 4:02 a.m. 4 o'clock passed quietly, without announcement.
Thomas opened his eyes again and straightened. This was the point in the shift when the night officially began to release him. Morning was still distant, but no longer abstract. The world beyond the station would soon stir. He stood and stretched gently, rolling his shoulders once. He walked toward the stove and adjusted it slightly, preparing for the cooler hour ahead. The metal responded with a faint sound, then settled. Outside, a barely noticeable change occurred. The birds had not begun to sing yet, but the silence felt less absolute, as though sound itself was preparing to return. Thomas returned to his desk and sat once more. He checked his watch. 4:18 a.m. Not long now. He allowed himself a small, quiet sense of completion. The night had passed as it always did, without incident, without interruption. He had done exactly what was required of him. He remained. The station remained, and together they waited calmly, patiently, for the first soft signs of morning to arrive.
The station remained still, holding its quiet like a secret. Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, stretching his legs under the desk, feeling the cold wood against his boots. The lamp above flickered once, small and gentle, then settled back into its steady glow. He let his eyes wander around the room, tracing familiar lines of shadow and light, the edges of benches, the faded paint along the walls, the small nicks and scratches that told the history of the building better than any ledger ever could. 4:37 a.m. The air outside had grown slightly crisper. Thomas opened the door just enough to let it drift in. A faint wind passed over the platform, rustling the edges of a loose sign near the tracks. He listened, hearing only the soft scrape of wood against the signpost before it stilled again. No birds yet, no distant engines, just the quiet breath of the night itself. He walked slowly along the platform, boots making muted sounds against the worn boards. The rails reflected the dim lamplight, silver lines stretching out into the darkness. He placed a hand lightly on the railing near the far edge, feeling its smooth, cold metal under his fingers. The station had a rhythm tonight, subtle and steady, and he moved in time with it without thought. Thomas returned inside and closed the door behind him. The warm air embraced him as he walked toward his desk. He pulled the ledger closer, not to write, but to feel the weight of it, the reassuring presence of its pages. The entries from previous nights lay neat and precise, small markers of moments in time that were otherwise unremarkable. He ran his fingers over the surface of the desk, noting every groove and imperfection. 5:01 a.m. A subtle change had begun outside. The darkness no longer felt heavy. It had softened into something almost velvety. Thomas stood and walked to the window, resting his hands lightly on the sill. The horizon in the east was still faint, almost imperceptible, but there was a slight difference in the color of the sky, a hint of gray that would eventually deepen into blue. He did not rush to notice it. There was no need. He lingered there for several minutes, listening to the quiet, letting the night's slow passage sink into him. Returning to his chair, he sat again and adjusted the lamp just slightly, bringing the light to a softer, warmer level. He took a small sip of water from the glass at his side. The liquid was cool, ordinary, and unremarkable. That, too, felt right. The telegraph remained silent. Its presence was a small comfort, a reminder of connection, even if that connection was dormant. Thomas placed a hand lightly on its smooth surface, feeling the metal cold beneath his touch. The machine made no sound, yet it felt as though it acknowledged him anyway. He leaned back slightly, eyes resting on nothing in particular. His thoughts drifted without direction, small memories surfacing like leaves floating on a still pond. The smell of coal on damp nights, the faint creak of the platform when heavy rain had passed,
the occasional sound of a dog barking somewhere far away. None of these demanded attention. They merely existed, quietly accompanying the long stretch of night. 5:29 a.m. Time moved forward, not abruptly, not dramatically, but in its own deliberate, measured way. Thomas did not glance at the clock often. He could feel the passage of hours in his body, in the air, in the subtle shifts of sound and shadow around him. He stood again and walked slowly to the stove, adjusting the heat slightly. The metal hissed faintly in response, settling back into its steady warmth. He let his hands linger on it for a moment, feeling the contrast between the cold air outside and the steady heat inside. Thomas returned to the window and stood for a while, observing the platform once more. The rails were unchanged, the boards beneath his feet quiet, the darkness shifting only subtly as the first hints of pre-dawn light began to stretch faintly across the horizon. The station remained patient, enduring, waiting for the day to arrive on its own schedule. He walked back to his chair and sat, folding his hands lightly in front of him. His eyes rested on the lamp, the ledger, the familiar lines of the walls. Each object held its place, unchanging and reliable. 5:52 a.m. The first distant sounds of the town were beginning to appear, though they were soft and hesitant. A rooster crowed far off. Somewhere a door opened slowly, then closed again. The wind carried a faint scent of damp earth and grass. Nothing rushed him. Nothing demanded attention. He remained in place, keeping watch over the station as it slowly transitioned from the stillness of night toward the faint stirrings of morning. And so Thomas waited. The air, the lamp, the rails, the desk, all existed in quiet harmony. Every small sound, every subtle shift was noted by him without urgency, without expectation. The night had passed as it always did, measured and calm. He breathed slowly, evenly, feeling the rhythm of hours settled into his body. The station remained steady. He remained steady. The world beyond might awaken soon, but here, in this small, unremarkable place, time had moved forward without fanfare, without haste, exactly as it always would. And Thomas, as always, was present to witness it.
Thomas shifted slightly in his chair, letting the warmth of the lamp wash over him. The early hints of gray on the horizon had become more pronounced now, though still delicate and tentative. The station, bathed in its soft yellow glow, seemed to hold the night's remnants gently, as if reluctant to let go. 6:11 a.m. A faint breeze stirred outside. It rattled a loose shutter along the side of the building, then passed, leaving only a whisper in its wake. Thomas stood and moved to the door, opening it just enough to feel the air brush against his face. Cool, clean, and quiet. The kind of morning air that carried nothing urgent, nothing demanding. He walked along the platform slowly, boots making soft contact with the worn boards. The rails gleamed faintly where the lamplight still touched them, leading the eye toward the horizon, now showing the faintest promise of dawn. He paused near the signal post and ran a hand lightly along its metal arm, noting the smoothness and the chill. Everything remained as it had been, unchanged, waiting patiently for the day to arrive. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door behind him and went back to his desk. The lamp had begun to lose some of its dominance, the gray of the morning slowly softening its glow. He poured himself another small cup of lukewarm coffee, taking it slowly, savoring the quiet taste. No hurry, no expectation, just the soft rhythm of the station and its night-long vigil. The telegraph remained silent, though Thomas did not expect otherwise. Its presence alone offered comfort, a reminder of connection that existed even in absence. He laid a hand on its surface lightly, feeling the metal cold against his skin. No messages would come for another hour or more, if at all, and that was fine.
He opened the ledger once more, flipping through the previous entries, sparse notes, small remarks about arrivals, departures, the weather, minor observations. He paused at a note written months earlier. Fog cleared by dawn, no delays, quiet night. He traced the letters with a fingertip, almost as if confirming that time had indeed moved exactly as noted. 6:38 a.m. The gray outside deepened slightly. The horizon hinted at faint colors, soft pinks and muted blues beginning to blend into the sky. Thomas did not rush to notice. He stood and stretched gently, feeling the stiffness of the long night ease gradually from his muscles. Each movement was slow, careful, deliberate. He walked toward the window and pressed a hand lightly against the glass, feeling its coolness, feeling the separation between inside and outside, between the station and the world awakening beyond it. The platform was empty. The fields beyond remained still. Somewhere distant, a bird chirped faintly, then stopped. The station held its quiet presence as if nothing else existed at all. Thomas returned to his chair and sat down. He folded his hands on the desk, letting the soft light from the lamp and the muted gray of the dawn wash over him. His mind wandered, though lazily, without insistence. Memories surfaced, small fragments of nights much like this one, hours marked by silence and patience. Nights when trains arrived briefly, departing just as quietly, and nights like this, when nothing stirred at all. 6:57 a.m. The morning sounds grew just a touch more distinct. A distant rooster crowed again, a faint creak of a door somewhere in town. Even the wind had softened, leaving behind only subtle hints of movement. Thomas did not move immediately. He allowed the station to adjust, to stretch, to transition from the night's slow, complete hold toward the awakening day. He rose and walked slowly to the platform once again, boots whispering across the boards. The rails caught the very first touches of light, glinting softly, almost shyly. He rested his hands on the railing, feeling the cold metal against his fingers. Nothing happened. Nothing needed to. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door gently. The lamp had dimmed further, giving more space to the emerging daylight. He leaned back in his chair, letting his eyes rest on the familiar forms around him, the ledger, the benches, the walls, the quiet objects that had watched over countless nights. The station remained patient. Thomas remained patient. Time moved on quietly, as it always did, measured in small increments. And in that calm, unbroken passage, the small-town train station and its solitary overnight keeper continued their slow vigil, each moment passing seamlessly into the next.
The pale light of dawn continued to spread slowly across the horizon. The station, once swallowed almost entirely by darkness, now revealed itself fully in the soft, muted tones of early morning. Thomas remained seated at his desk, his hands folded loosely, listening to the subtle changes that came with the day's first stirrings. 7:14 a.m. A faint rustle passed through the air outside. Thomas rose, moving with the same slow deliberation he had maintained throughout the night. He opened the door and stepped onto the platform, the cool air brushing his face and carrying with it the faint scent of damp earth and morning dew. The boards beneath his boots were still firm, the rails catching the light in gentle glints that stretched toward the horizon. He walked to the far end of the platform and paused, letting his gaze drift along the tracks. They ran straight and unbroken into the distance, untouched by the first train of the day. Somewhere beyond the fields, a crow called softly, its sound distant and restrained. Thomas listened, noting the presence of life without needing it to demand attention. Turning slowly,
He made his way back toward the station, each step deliberate. The wooden boards creaked faintly, a reminder that the building itself was alive in subtle ways, moving in response to the world around it. He paused once near the bench, running a hand lightly along its worn edge. The surface was smooth now from years of use, and yet it retained the faint impressions of countless hands before his own. Inside, the lamp flickered faintly in response to the growing daylight, casting soft shadows along the walls. Thomas adjusted it slightly, lowering it to blend with the emerging gray outside. The room felt neither dark nor bright, but comfortably in between, balanced for the slow arrival of the morning. He reached for the ledger again, not to write, but to open it, flipping through pages with gentle fingers. The entries were sparse, simple records of nights long past. He paused at one from the previous winter. Snow covered the platform, no trains expected until dawn. Station quiet. He traced the letters lightly with his fingertip, feeling the ink ridges against his skin. A small smile passed across his face, though he did not consider it significant. 7:36 a.m. The sound of distant movement began to emerge, not from the station itself, but from the town beyond. Faint footsteps on distant roads, a door opening somewhere in a house, the occasional clatter of a bucket or tin in a yard. Thomas did not move toward it or seek it out. He simply noted it, allowing the awareness to settle in alongside the steady rhythm of the clock. He returned to the window, resting his palms lightly on the sill. The sky had shifted now, the gray deepening to a muted blue, punctuated with hints of pink near the horizon. The world beyond the station was awakening, slowly, carefully. Thomas did not rush. He did not need to. There was no urgency in this place, no pressure to match the pace of the larger world. Stepping back, he returned to his chair and lowered himself into it slowly. The lamp's warmth met him halfway, and the air carried a quiet freshness that hinted at the coming day. He took a small sip of water, placing the glass back with measured care. The movement was deliberate, reinforcing the slow cadence that had carried him through the night. 7:58 a.m. Thomas glanced at the clock. The time was irrelevant in most ways, yet he noticed it, noting the small shift in hours as the morning edged closer. The station remained patient, the desk steady, the rails outside reflecting the softening light. He stood once more, stretching, moving to the window again. His fingers pressed lightly against the cool glass, feeling the temperature and weight of the day approaching. The platform beyond showed no sign of immediate activity. No trains, no passengers, only the first faint stirrings of the town and the soft breeze rustling through the grass. Returning inside, Thomas walked slowly to the stove and adjusted the heat slightly, though it was no longer necessary for comfort. The gesture was habitual, grounding, a small act that connected him to the night just past. He let his hands linger on the metal surface for a moment, before stepping back toward the desk. 8:21 a.m. He sat again, folding his hands and resting his gaze on the room around him. The ledger, the benches, the walls, all familiar, all steady. He did not rush to move or check the platform. There was still time, still space to let the world transition at its own pace. Outside, the first soft hints of activity began to emerge. A bird chirped briefly, then fell silent. The wind shifted, carrying the faint scent of the earth and nearby fields. Thomas breathed slowly, letting the rhythm of his body match the gradual movement of time around him. The telegraph remained still, but Thomas did not notice. Its silence was comforting, not frustrating. It was a quiet witness to the hours, just as he was. 8:41 a.m. A shadow of light stretched farther across the platform. The rails caught it in soft reflections. The station itself seemed to exhale lightly, as if the night had finally decided to let go. Thomas allowed himself to acknowledge it without haste. There was no rush. The day would arrive. The trains would come. The people would stir. But for now, he remained. The station remained. And in that shared, measured patience, the world felt exactly as it should. The clock ticked. The lamp glowed softly. The rails reflected the gentle light. And Thomas, solitary and steady, continued to keep watch over a place where time moved quietly, seamlessly, and entirely in its own deliberate manner.
The light outside continued to grow, soft and tentative, yet it reached steadily across the platform now. Thomas sat quietly at his desk, hands resting lightly in his lap, feeling the subtle warmth of the lamp blend with the approaching morning. Every corner of the station seemed aware of the shift. Walls, benches, the ledger, even the floorboards, all responding in their slow, imperceptible way to the passage of hours. 9:03 a.m. A faint rustle reached him from outside. Thomas stood and moved toward the door, opening it just enough to let the air brush his face. The coolness had softened into a gentle freshness. The boards beneath his boots felt dry now, their texture familiar and grounding. He walked slowly along the platform, observing the rails as they caught the increasing light. They stretched straight into the distance, unchanged from the night before, silent, steady, patient. He paused near the signal post and ran a hand along the cold metal, noting the small scratches and worn spots from decades of use. He had done this countless times before, yet each touch reminded him of the quiet continuity of the station, of the unremarkable, steady life it contained. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door gently. The warmth of the station met him again, a soft contrast to the cool morning. He walked slowly to the desk, lowering himself into his chair with measured care. The lamp flickered slightly, but held its glow, softened now to coexist with the daylight. He poured himself a small cup of coffee, lukewarm and steady, drinking it slowly. Each sip matched the measured pace of the morning. There was no hurry. There had never been a hurry here, only the small, deliberate actions that kept the station alive, even when no one else noticed. 9:26 a.m. Outside, the first faint sounds of activity began to emerge more clearly. A distant cart creaked over the cobblestones. Somewhere, a child laughed softly. A door opened and closed somewhere down the street. Thomas did not move toward these sounds. He observed them as one might watch the movement of clouds, gentle, distant, and entirely separate from himself. He turned his attention back to the ledger, not to write, but to glance at it. Empty of new notes, its pages reflected the calm continuity of nights past, each entry a quiet testament to the hours, small observations, nothing dramatic. He traced the letters of the previous night's note with a fingertip. Station remains quiet. Night passed. He allowed himself a brief acknowledgement of the truth in that, then closed the book carefully. 9:49 a.m. Thomas rose and moved to the window. He rested a hand lightly on the sill, watching the platform bathed in pale sunlight. The mist that had clung faintly to the fields earlier had disappeared entirely. The rails glinted softly, and the station seemed to hold a delicate balance between night's lingering calm
and the approaching day. He walked slowly back to his chair, adjusting the lamp slightly to allow daylight to mingle with its glow. The room felt neither bright nor dim, a liminal space, caught perfectly between one day and the next. He folded his hands on the desk and rested his gaze on the familiar forms around him, the benches, the walls, the telegraph, the ledger, each object unchanged, steady, patient. The clock ticked steadily. 10:11 a.m. The town was stirring now, slowly, hesitantly. Faint voices reached him from distant streets. The occasional sound of a horse or cart punctuated the quiet. Thomas did not move toward these noises. Instead, he observed, letting it filter in gently as part of the station's slow integration with the waking world. He sipped his coffee again, letting the warmth settle in. The routine, the simple acts of being here, remained unchanged, as necessary now as it had been at midnight. There was comfort in the repetition, in the quiet acknowledgement that some places existed to maintain continuity, to hold time, even when nothing dramatic occurred. 10:34 a.m. The sunlight now reached fully across the platform. Shadows receded. The station felt different in this light, yet unchanged in its purpose. Thomas stood and walked to the platform once more, boots making quiet contact with the boards. He observed the rails as they disappeared toward the horizon. A soft breeze moved across the platform, rustling leaves and carrying the faint scent of damp earth. He returned inside after several minutes, closing the door behind him with a soft click. The warmth of the station and the growing light combined into a comfortable stillness. He walked back to his chair and sat, allowing his body to adjust to the slow progression of the morning. The telegraph remained silent, yet Thomas barely noticed. Its stillness was no longer surprising. It was part of the station's rhythm, as enduring as the wood, the walls, the lamp. 10:57 a.m. He leaned back slightly, closing his eyes for a brief moment, letting the soft rhythm of his breathing match the slow, measured flow of the world around him. Outside, the town continued its gentle awakening. Inside, the station remained in patient harmony with him. Time moved forward, slowly, seamlessly, as it always did. And Thomas, ever steady, continued to bear witness, keeping watch over the quiet place where the night had passed and the day had begun, each moment unfolding exactly as it should.
The sun continued to rise, its light growing stronger and spilling further across the platform. The shadows that had lingered in the corners of the station now receded fully, revealing every detail Thomas had come to know intimately over countless nights and mornings. He remained seated at his desk, hands folded loosely, observing the room in quiet attention. 11:18 a.m. The sounds of the town grew steadily clearer. A distant cart rolled over cobblestones with a rhythmic clatter. A dog barked faintly somewhere behind a wooden fence. Voices, soft and indistinct, drifted up from the streets below. Thomas did not rise. He did not need to. He listened without expectation, allowing the activity to exist in parallel with the stillness of the station. He glanced at the ledger once more. Empty of new notes, its pages reflected the continuity of the night and the gentle progression of the morning. There was no urgency in writing anything down. The act of presence, of quiet observation, was enough. Rising slowly, Thomas walked toward the door again. The platform greeted him with warmth now, the early chill gone entirely. The boards beneath his boots were dry and familiar,
their grooves worn smooth by decades of footsteps. He moved along the rails slowly, pausing to rest a hand on the signal post. The metal was cool, reassuring, unchanged. He ran his fingers along it, noting the small dents and scratches that bore silent witness to the countless nights and mornings it had endured. Returning inside, he closed the door carefully. The warmth of the station enveloped him, the lamp's glow mingling with the morning light to create a soft, comforting atmosphere. He walked back to the desk and lowered himself into the chair with deliberate slowness, allowing the familiar support to ease the lingering stiffness from the long night. 11:42 a.m. He poured another small cup of coffee, drinking it with measured sips, letting the warmth spread through him. Outside, a bird called softly, its song carried lightly on the morning breeze. Somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of hammering or construction drifted faintly. Thomas did not rise to investigate. He acknowledged these sounds only in passing, as one might acknowledge the changing patterns of clouds in the sky. The telegraph remained silent as it had all night. Its presence was a constant, steady, reassuring. He placed a hand on it lightly, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers, and then removed it without haste. There was no urgency in the action. The station moved in its own rhythm, and he moved with it. 12:04 a.m. The morning had fully claimed the platform now. The rails glinted in the sunlight, the boards of the platform warm beneath his touch. Thomas rose slowly, stretching his shoulders and arms, then walked to the window. His palms pressed lightly against the cool glass, and he gazed at the town beyond. The streets were now alive with activity. Townspeople walking, carts moving, animals calling softly. The station, in contrast, remained still, a quiet anchor amidst the growing energy. He walked back to his chair and sat, letting his hands rest on the desk. He closed his eyes for a brief moment, allowing himself to feel the rhythm of the day settle alongside the remnants of the night. The transition was complete, yet still gentle, unhurried, seamless. 12:27 a.m. A faint gust of wind shifted the air outside, carrying the scent of hay and earth from nearby fields. Thomas observed it without moving from the chair. He let the details of the world filter in naturally, the changing temperature, the movement of light across the walls, the distant murmur of life beyond the station. He did not act. He merely bore witness, steady and patient. He glanced at the lamp. Its soft glow now seemed almost ornamental, overshadowed by the sun pouring in through the windows. He adjusted it slightly, not to increase light, but to keep the space balanced, allowing the station itself to remain in harmony with the day. 12:51 a.m. Thomas sipped the last of his coffee slowly, placing the cup down with care. Outside, the town continued its steady rhythm. The distant hum of activity was now constant, a gentle undertone to the station's enduring stillness. He leaned back in the chair, folding his hands once more, letting the calm of the place fill him completely. The clock ticked steadily. Time continued its seamless movement, marked not by events, but by the patient observation of moments passing naturally. The station, steadfast and quiet, held its place, and Thomas, its solitary keeper, continued to witness each fraction of time without interruption, without judgment, exactly as it unfolded. He exhaled slowly, listening to the world and the station together, a single steady rhythm that required nothing more than presence. And so the morning stretched on, quietly, deliberately, seamlessly. The afternoon sun climbed higher, spilling more light across the station platform. Thomas remained at his desk, seated with his hands resting lightly in his lap, letting the warmth of the day settle into the room. The lamplight had faded almost entirely,
surrendering to the natural illumination streaming through the windows. Shadows lingered faintly along the walls and under the benches, soft and unobtrusive, as though aware they must not disturb the steady rhythm of the day. 1:13 p.m. Outside, the distant sounds of life grew more distinct. A cart clattered down a far street, its wheels striking the stones with measured repetition. A child's laugh echoed faintly from behind a fence, carried softly by the breeze. Somewhere, the faint bark of a dog punctuated the otherwise gentle murmur of activity. Thomas did not rise. He listened without reaction, letting the sounds blend into the station's steady heartbeat. He reached for the ledger once more, opening it slowly. The pages were empty of new entries, yet their presence felt reassuring. He traced a finger along the margin, feeling the faint indentations of old ink, the subtle texture of paper that had absorbed countless nights and mornings. There was no urge to write. The act of observing, of existing within this space at this precise moment, was enough. Thomas stood slowly, stretching his arms above his head. He moved toward the platform door, letting in the soft afternoon air. It was warmer now than it had been at dawn, the breeze carrying the faint scent of hay and sun-baked earth from the surrounding fields. He stepped onto the boards, boots pressing against familiar textures, feeling the gentle warmth of the wood beneath his feet. He paused at the center of the platform, resting a hand lightly on the railing. The metal was cool to the touch, contrasting with the sun-warmed boards beneath him. He allowed his gaze to follow the rails as they stretched endlessly toward the horizon, unbroken and unchanging. The sky above was clear now, the sun high enough to cast short shadows, soft and steady. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door behind him. The station welcomed him back with its familiar warmth. He moved to his chair and sat slowly, letting his body adjust to the steady weight of the day. He adjusted the lamp slightly, more out of habit than necessity, aligning its soft glow with the incoming light. 1:36 p.m. The telegraph remained silent. Its presence alone was enough to remind him of the continuity of the station, the long, unbroken rhythm of days and nights, the unspoken stories of trains that had come and gone, passengers who had arrived and departed. He rested a hand on the machine lightly, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers, then withdrew it after a moment. There was no urgency, no anticipation. The station and its keeper existed in perfect alignment with time itself. He leaned back slightly, letting his gaze drift across the room. The benches, worn and familiar, held the marks of countless lives that had passed through the station. The walls, faded with age, retained subtle traces of every hour spent within them. The desk, solid and steadfast, carried the weight of his presence without complaint. Thomas allowed his eyes to rest on these objects without thought, appreciating the quiet constancy they provided. 1:58 p.m. The sounds outside shifted subtly. A hammer struck a distant worksite, the rhythmic echo carried lightly by the afternoon air. A cart rolled down the street, wheels striking stone with a faint, deliberate clatter. A child's laugh echoed faintly from behind a fence, carried softly by the breeze. Somewhere, the faint bark of a dog punctuated the otherwise gentle murmur of activity. Thomas did not rise. He listened without reaction, letting the sounds blend into the station's steady heartbeat. He reached for the ledger once more, opening it slowly. The pages were empty of new entries, yet their presence felt reassuring. He traced a finger along the margin, feeling the faint indentations of old ink, the subtle texture of paper that had absorbed countless nights and mornings. There was no urge to write. The act of observing,
of existing within this space at this precise moment was enough. Thomas stood slowly, stretching his arms above his head. He moved toward the platform door, letting in the soft afternoon air. It was warmer now than it had been at dawn, the breeze carrying the faint scent of hay and sun-baked earth from the surrounding fields. He stepped onto the boards, boots pressing against familiar textures, feeling the gentle warmth of the wood beneath his feet. He paused at the center of the platform, resting a hand lightly on the railing. The metal was cool to the touch, contrasting with the sun-warmed boards beneath him. He allowed his gaze to follow the rails as they stretched endlessly toward the horizon, unbroken and unchanging. The sky above was clear now, the sun high enough to cast short shadows, soft and steady. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door behind him. The station welcomed him back with its familiar warmth. He moved to his chair and sat slowly, letting his body adjust to the steady weight of the day. He adjusted the lamp slightly, more out of habit than necessity, aligning its soft glow with the incoming light. 1:36 p.m. The telegraph remained silent. Its presence alone was enough to remind him of the continuity of the station, the long, unbroken rhythm of days and nights, the unspoken stories of trains that had come and gone, passengers who had arrived and departed. He rested a hand on the machine lightly, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers, then withdrew it after a moment. There was no urgency, no anticipation. The station and its keeper existed in perfect alignment with time itself. He leaned back slightly, letting his gaze drift across the room. The benches, worn and familiar, held the marks of countless lives that had passed through the station. The walls, faded with age, retained subtle traces of every hour spent within them. The desk, solid and steadfast, carried the weight of his presence without complaint. Thomas allowed his eyes to rest on these objects without thought, appreciating the quiet constancy they provided. 1:58 p.m. The sounds outside shifted subtly. A hammer struck a distant worksite, the rhythmic echo carried lightly by the afternoon air. A cart rolled down the street, wheels striking stone with a faint, deliberate clatter. A child's laugh echoed faintly from behind a fence, carried softly by the breeze. Somewhere, the faint bark of a dog punctuated the otherwise gentle murmur of activity. Thomas did not rise. He listened without reaction, letting the sounds blend into the station's steady heartbeat. He reached for the ledger once more, opening it slowly. The pages were empty of new entries, yet their presence felt reassuring. He traced a finger along the margin, feeling the faint indentations of old ink, the subtle texture of paper that had absorbed countless nights and mornings. There was no urge to write. The act of observing, of existing within this space at this precise moment, was enough. Thomas stood slowly, stretching his arms above his head. He moved toward the platform door, letting in the soft afternoon air. It was warmer now than it had been at dawn, the breeze carrying the faint scent of hay and sun-baked earth from the surrounding fields. He stepped onto the boards, boots pressing against familiar textures, feeling the gentle warmth of the wood beneath his feet. He paused at the center of the platform, resting a hand lightly on the railing. The metal was cool to the touch, contrasting with the sun-warmed boards beneath him. He allowed his gaze to follow the rails as they stretched endlessly toward the horizon, unbroken and unchanging. The sky above was clear now, the sun high enough to cast short shadows, soft and steady. Returning inside, Thomas closed the door behind him. The station welcomed him back with its familiar warmth. He moved to his chair and sat slowly, letting his body adjust to the steady weight of the day. He adjusted the lamp slightly, more out of habit than necessity, aligning its soft glow with the incoming light. 1:36 p.m. The telegraph remained silent. Its presence alone was enough to remind him of the continuity of the station, the long, unbroken rhythm of days and nights, the unspoken stories of trains that had come and gone, passengers who had arrived and departed. He rested a hand on the machine lightly, feeling the smooth metal beneath his fingers, then withdrew it after a moment. There was no urgency,